True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. Oh, hi there, True Crime Conversations listeners. Whether you're brand new here or have been with us from the very beginning, welcome. I'm your host, Claire Murphy, and like so many of you, I have always had a very deep interest in true crime. I don't know about you, but I read it, I watch it, I listen to it. And True Crime Conversations is about giving victims a voice and speaking with people who really know the cases. Journalists, authors, and experts who've spent time researching what really happened. We are not here to sensationalise. Our goal is to create a space for respectful, important conversations that go deeper than the headlines. Many of the stories that we cover do focus on women, and that's because, sadly, women make up the majority of victims in violent crimes. In fact, 1 in 4 women in Australia has experienced violence by an intimate partner since the age of 15. But we do cover a wide range of cases, from disappearances and scams to shocking assaults and murders, cases from here in Australia and all over the world. And even though we're an Aussie-made podcast, you will hear voices from just about everywhere. Survivors, experts, and storytellers who bring these cases to life. And if there's ever a case that you'd like us to cover, or a survivor you think we should really speak to, we would love to hear from you. You can send us an email or a voice note, and there are links for both of those in the show notes. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to be doing True Crime Conversations a little bit differently. We are re-releasing a few episodes from the very early days of this podcast, and we're talking way back in 2019 when the excellent Jessie Stephens was hosting. Now, usually we don't go back and redo episodes because a lot of the cases we cover are what we call evergreen. So that means you can scroll back and listen to them at any time. But these early episodes came out so long ago that we're thinking some of you might have missed them. So we're bringing a few of them back, and we hope you'll find something new or hear a story that you hadn't come across before. Today, we're revisiting the story of Belgian backpacker Davine Arckens. This is a truly chilling case. In 2017, Davine was lured to a remote South Australian property by a man named Jean Charles Bristow. He kidnapped her, assaulted her, and held her captive. But she managed to escape. And it's a story of both trauma and incredible strength. There haven't been any major public updates on this case since 2019, but it remains one of Australia's most disturbing and memorable. Award-winning journalist Richard Guilliatt, who covered the case, joins Jessie Stephens in this episode to walk us through what happened. After you've listened, we would love to know your thoughts, especially if this is a case that you haven't heard of before. And don't forget, we're also on TikTok at True Crime Conversations, where you can find quick explainers and clips from our interviews. You can DM us there too if you want to get in touch.
A quick warning, this episode contains discussions of sexual assault and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. Sweat was trickling down Lucy Arnaud's back as she stepped off the bus in Murray Bridge, an hour or so from Adelaide in South Australia. It was February 9, the thick of the Australian summer. Back in Belgium, her friends would be freezing. But here she was, about to embark on a lone backpacking trip around Australia. Petite and quiet, Lucy was excited about her big adventure in a country that she thought was safe and full of people who were friendly and nice. As she stood at the bus stop, she spotted the man she was waiting for, Max. But as she would later find out, his name wasn't actually Max at all. I'm Jessie Stephens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm joined by Walkley award-winning journalist, author and staff writer for The Australian, Richard Guilliatt. In March of this year, Guilliatt wrote a story for the Weekend Australian magazine titled, "I've Been Kidnapped, No Joke." It was about a 24-year-old woman who, until this week, had her name kept private for legal reasons. She's recently come out into the public eye and revealed that her real name is Davine Arckens. But for this story, we're going to call her Lucy Arnaud, the name given to her by Richard in his reporting. It was February 9th, 2017, when a woman who we'll call Lucy meets a man who we're going to call Max at a place called Murray Bridge in South Australia. Why is she there? What's brought her to that point?
Well, she's a backpacker and she's on an adventure that many Europeans go on in Australia. She was quite an experienced traveller in some ways. She'd been to a number of other countries. She'd been to China and she'd worked in wildlife parks in South Africa. She'd also trekked a bit in South America. And she was studying in Europe. I think she wanted to be a vet. This was her next adventure, and it was one of those classic adventure travel backpacker trips where she arrived in Sydney. She'd been to Tasmania to see the wilderness down there. She'd hiked in the Blue Mountains. And her plan was, like a lot of backpackers, she wanted to try and extend her trip. And the way you do that, you get an extra year if you work 88 days in the rural area of Australia, and you then become eligible for an extra year on your visa. So she had travelled, I think, on a package tour from Victoria across to Adelaide, and she was staying in a backpacker place, and she had been to Kangaroo Island, and she was now planning the rest of her trip, which involved going up to the Northern Territory, but she wanted to get some farm work under her belt before she did that, because she had to clock up these days. And so she was in a backpacker place in Adelaide, and she started looking on Gumtree for farm work.
Nearly 250,000 backpackers come to Australia every year. They follow a well-worn backpacker tourist path, and they work in bars, on building sites and on farms. To get a 2-year visa, backpackers must spend at least 3 months working somewhere rural. Many farmers rely on working holidaymakers.
The backpackers dominate our workforce now. It's obviously hard work. We're outside all the time. We work in varying weather conditions. You're bent over. It's just the type of work that Aussies don't want to do anymore.
What sort of farm work is it? What kind of things do backpackers go and do on farms?
Well, there's fruit picking. It's manual labour. It's helping out with mustering. But I think a lot of it is very simple farm labour work, digging, fencing, whatever help is available. Gumtree is the sort of locus of all that, and where a lot of backpackers go to find work and where a lot of farmers advertise. It's a thriving business in a sense, and, a lot of farmers will tell you that without backpackers they could barely operate their properties because a lot of Australians don't want to do that work, whereas for a lot of tourists it's kind of part of the adventure is working in the bush in Australia.
And the accommodation and everything is included. That's the idea too, that you stay there.
Correct.
And so what do we know about this man Max who's met her to pick her up?
Well, we know plenty about him now. At that time, Lucy knew nothing. So she goes on to Gumtree and he contacts her and says, yes, I work for this company called Genesis, and we have these farms a few hours outside of Adelaide, and we hire a lot of backpackers. We've had French backpackers, and he spins this whole story to her about how he prefers female backpackers because they're much more gentle with the animals, and she will be sort of helping milk cows and look after calves. He makes it very enticing for her, and she's got an interest in animal welfare anyway. I think that for a lot of people like her, Australia is seen as this very safe destination where there haven't been major terrorist attacks. Crime is quite low compared to a lot of overseas destinations, and there's a feeling that you're very safe here. In fact, she did say later on that her image of Australia was of an incredibly friendly, safe place. And so, like a lot of young women who are travelling here, I think there's a kind of false sense of security there, which led to her putting herself in quite a dicey situation because she actually didn't know who Max was, and she just took on face value what he was saying. And so he said, look, get on the bus, and gave her the details, and I'll meet you in Murray Bridge and I'll take you to the farm. And that's what she did.
I did ask questions to get more information. He spoke about another French girl who was recently going to another farm. So that made me feel a bit more reassured, like, okay, there's other people doing this job.
And can I ask you about that sense of safety? Because in Australian criminal history, like if you look at Ivan Milat, I mean, that's one of our most infamous, crimes. Why is it that hasn't sort of rattled that tourist economy in terms of Australia still feeling like a safe destination?
I was really puzzled by this too, because I'd seen one survey where a lot of overseas travellers weren't even aware of the Belanglo murders or the Bradley Murdoch kidnapping in Central Australia. And so I got to say that really surprised me, because I had thought those crimes got saturation coverage. I think they got saturation coverage in England, but I think in Europe there's still this image. And in fact, when I interviewed backpacker company people, they said that safety is one of the least important issues that people raise with them before they're coming out here, apart from the possibility of being attacked by a wild animal. I mean, one of them joked that Steve Irwin being, killed in the ocean has given Australia a much greater image for danger than any serial killer or, sex crimes guy out there.
Wow. So she then gets in a car with this man, who she obviously believes is taking her to do some farm work, and they're in the car for 2 hours or so. Where does he take her?
So Max is this guy in his 50s, and he's got a bushy sort of goatee and curly hair, and we know that his real name is Jean Bristow, and he operates a hobby farm in Meningie, which is a sort of a touristy town on a lake about an hour and a half out of Adelaide. But he spins this whole story that his name's Max, and he takes her on this very circuitous drive to his farm. So he heads southeast from Murray Bridge, but he goes down into the Lake District. And as you head into this area, it gets kind of more swampy, and there's estuaries, and it starts to look a lot more sort of barren, the landscape. And you have to cross a couple of rivers on ferries. And so it takes 2.5 hours to get to Meningie that way. And along the way, you pass some pretty dry and empty landscape. And so Lucy would have had a sense that she was, I think, heading out to quite a remote spot. And that was obviously Bristow's intention, to make her feel that she was a long way from Adelaide. Along the way, he's chatting to her about the work they'll be doing, and he's sort of talking it up, that she'll be, interacting with the animals, and that this company Genesis that he supposedly works for. And so it takes them about 2.5 hours to reach his place, and he also drives into his property through a back road. So she never sees the town of Meningie. And I'm sure that to her, it seemed like she had been taken to quite a remote spot. And she would have had no idea that she was really only a little over 90 minutes from Adelaide, and just really like a 5-minute walk from the town of Meningie, just down the street.
He told me I could take a bus to Murray Bridge, so I looked it up, and it seemed fine to me. It was not that far, and it was easy to go there. He told me that he would pick me up at the bus station, so I just had to look for the bus, get there, and that would be it.
So he takes her to almost like a farmhouse. Can you describe the facility that she sort of walked into?
Well, it's a pig shed, and it's essentially an abandoned pig shed, because Bristow was not really a farmer. I mean, he had been a farmer and worked on dairy farms, but he was really a labourer who'd been in and out of employment in Meningie, and was had a terrible reputation as an employee. He'd been sacked from a number of jobs, and when I spoke to people in the town, they described him as just an argumentative, sort of troublemaker sort of a guy. And he worked at the council dump and had taken them to court for unfair dismissal. So his farm was really just a hobby farm with a few head of cattle on it. And his house and this pig shed, he didn't have any pigs. So this thing was cinder block building, corrugated iron roof, sort of open to the elements, straw on the floor, stalls for animals, and a fridge that wasn't plugged in, a huge hive of bees in one corner, and this filthy sofa, which was all cut up and clearly worse for wear and tear, which was actually positioned over a grate where you were designed to sweep animal droppings into. And so Lucy Arnaud walks into this place with Max, as she thinks he's called, and looks around and realises that this is where he's proposing that she's going to stay. And at this point, she's obviously completely confused, and he's still talking to her, and then he says that he needs to make sure she's not a druggie, and he needs to check her feet for needle marks. And so he needs her to lie face down on the sofa, which she does. And it's at that point that the whole thing turns very nasty.
And you can understand why she would, because she's a woman completely alone in what she thinks is a very isolated country town with a man that she doesn't know. You sort of don't have an option to stand there and say, no, why would I do that?
Well, I think she must have realised at that point that she'd made a very big error, because she actually didn't know where she was. He had told her they were near a town which was actually about an hour away, and she didn't know who he was. She didn't know where she was, and he's quite a big guy. And Lucy Arnaud is quite a small girl, and even young woman. She was 24, and even though she had travelled a lot, I saw her in court when she presented her victim impact statement, and she did have an air of sort of innocence about her, and I could imagine that she would have been sort of panicking at this point and wondering what to do. And so she complied with his instructions to lie down, and at that point he suddenly grabs her arms and ties them behind her and jabs her in the shoulder with something, and she looks back and it appears to be a gun. She then realises that this guy has ill intentions.
And what did he then proceed to do to her over the course of the sort of afternoon?
Well, he took her clothes off, apart from, I think, her bra, and he sexually assaulted her a number of times over the next 24 hours, and he kept her tied up for most of that time. I didn't mention this in my story, but Bristow was actually impotent. So it was just this weird aspect of the case where he was incapable of committing full rape, but he sexually assaulted her and sort of groped her, and he seemed to, at one point he even kissed her. There was something kind of pathetic, even though what he did was incredibly malevolent at the same time. There was something quite kind of pathetic about his behaviour as well, to me. I don't know if a woman would agree with that. But so for the first, several hours, he sexually assaulted her, and then he told her this whole story in order to frighten her into compliance, which was that he was working for this organisation that essentially kidnapped young women, and that there were other women who were being held on other farms, and that if she tried to escape, he would shoot her because the operation could not be exposed, and that the people he worked for were paying off the local police. And so there was no point trying to escape, because if the police picked her up, they would simply bring her back here. And she would end up on one of the other farms where the people who were running them were far more cruel than he was, and she would be drugged, and even more appalling things would happen to her, whereas he was one of the nice guys.
Didn't he say something too about snakes or something about the wildlife around it?
Yeah, he also intimated that it was incredibly dangerous in the surrounding areas, and I think he was trying to give her the impression that they were virtually in the desert, and that she would be lucky to sort of get far without being bitten or somehow attacked by something. And of course she had no reason to disbelieve that, because all she had seen was acres and, in fact, miles and miles of empty paddocks on the drive there. And you couldn't see the farmhouse from where she was. So she wasn't even aware, for instance, that Bristow's wife and son and daughter-in-law were living just 200 metres up the hill in the farmhouse. And nor were Bristow's family aware that he had carried out this bizarre kidnapping, which he somehow seemed to think that he could get away with.
So they didn't hear anything?
No.
Because she wouldn't have even thought that if she yelled that people would hear, right? Because she's imagining that she's completely isolated.
That's right. And so she, I think, decided for self-preservation to just comply with him, and he would leave her in the shed for hours, and then come back with food or water, but then sexually assault her again. And eventually he rigged up this chain arrangement, so she was chained with one foot and one arm to the wall using a kind of G-bolt. And from memory, she had one arm and one leg free. As it grew dark, he left her there, and at some point I think he suggested to her that she might be let free the next day. And then he went back to his wife and son in the house and presumably had dinner and watched TV with them, bizarrely enough.
In the beginning it's very commanding. When I walk in here, you'll be always undressed. You don't put on anything anymore. That I'll have to be kind, that I don't run away. Or he would find me and shoot me with the gun. I was just stuck there, and I thought it would take a while for someone to notice I was gone or even to find me. So I was like, I'm not getting out of here. I thought this is it. This is where I'm gonna die.
And so while he's inside and he's sort of left her for a few hours, and at this point I think he's taken her phone and stuff, doesn't she have access to a backpack?
Yeah, he had taken her phone and her main bag, but he had left her backpack in the shed with her and failed to look at its contents. This was the thing that struck me about this whole bizarre case, was Bristow's complete incompetence. You just couldn't fathom how he thought he was going to get away with this, and you couldn't fathom his complete lack of thinking through. He certainly was no criminal mastermind. So he leaves her there in the shed with this backpack. Darkness is falling, and she has a laptop in there, and she's got a dongle, an internet dongle. And so she reaches across to this fridge because he had opened it and she'd seen that there were some implements in there, and she managed to get something out of the fridge which she managed to loosen this G-bolt with over a period of some time. And so she was able to free herself after, I think, about half an hour of working away at this G-bolt on the chains. And she scurried over to her backpack and pulled out her laptop and USB dongle. And by this stage it's dark, and she, of course, has no idea when he's going to come back. And she gets an internet connection on the dongle, and she contacts a number of people. First of all, she sends a message to Belgium, where her family live. And then she manages to, I think that was a Facebook message to a member of her family. And then she managed to contact a friend in Queensland on a audio connection and had a conversation with her and basically told her that she'd been kidnapped and she was in this shed somewhere outside Adelaide and she had no idea where she was. And the friend contacted the police while she was on the phone. And so she knew the police had been alerted at that point, but then that connection dropped out. And while she was still had the internet connection, she sent these frantic messages to, she thought it was the police, but it was actually the police association, the police union. She found the police association website and she managed to type out this frantic message, which I could read. Been kidnapped, Murray Bridge to Lameroo, I think. A cow farm, crossed 2 ferries. Got chains loose, afraid to run away. He might chase and shoot me. Please help look for me. Please, please, I'm so afraid. Please, I'm on a farm somewhere. He drives a red pickup. So she loses the internet connection shortly after sending that, and she's fearful, in fact, that the light from the laptop screen will alert him or that he'll come back. And so she shuts the laptop down and puts it back and then rechains herself up to the wall and just waits. And she's naked on this sofa with just, I think he gave her a coat to throw over herself. And so she spends this sleepless night in this pig shed with these bees buzzing in the corner, waiting to see what's going to happen the next morning and whether the police are going to respond.
What are the police thinking at this point? Because that would be very bizarre, getting a message like that in terms of even understanding whether it was real or not. Do the police take this seriously straight away? My sense of it is that the police did take this very seriously straight away, because they immediately held a press conference and released photos of her early the next morning. Her photo was on the front page of the Adelaide Advertiser, in fact, as a missing person. And they sent a large number of cars from various different squads down to the Meningie area. And because they had such specific information, you know, that they were looking for a red pickup and it was around the Lameroo sort of area, they seem to have narrowed it down to Meningie quite quickly. So by, I think, mid-next morning, there were police planes circling over Meningie, and there were certainly a lot of police presence in Murray Bridge, for instance. And so it did seem like the police responded very quickly.
Good evening. Major crime police are leading the search for a Belgian tourist they fear has been abducted while on holiday in South Australia. And there are tonight grave fears for her safety.
We believe she was potentially picked up by a person in a red pickup type vehicle. We have grave concerns that she's being held against her will.
Did Bristow have any idea that this was happening?
He came in the next morning and he gave her some breakfast and sexually assaulted her again. You know, this weird sort of combination of giving her food and expressing this idea that he was going to set her free and he was one of the good guys, while at the same time, you know, sexually assaulting her. And then he went into Meningie and he picked up the fact that there were a lot of cops in the area. And I think, in fact, that her photo would have been in the Adelaide Advertiser perhaps that morning. I just can't remember that entirely myself. But he certainly by 10 o'clock knew that something was up. And he himself was pulled over driving his red pickup by 2 cops outside Meningie. And they photographed him and took down some details, but didn't really press him all that much. And because the police plane had spotted his pickup and reported it in. And so he got back to the farm and he was, of course, in a total panic at this point, because he realised that somehow, you know, word had got out. And so he said to her that they had to leave immediately. He got her to throw on some clothes, and she grabbed her backpack, and he told her to run across the farm to this cluster of trees a few hundred metres away, and he came around in his wife's car because he didn't want to be driving the red pickup to collect her.
Was he a suspect at this point? So the police have taken a photo of him and seen the car. Are they thinking of investigating any further?
I'm sure he was a suspect at this point because he'd already been pulled over and photographed. Look, I don't know how many people had red pickups in that area, but my sense of it was that they had narrowed it down to Meningie and had him in their sights. He seems to have had this bizarre idea that he could drive her back to Murray Bridge and that she would be so freaked out that she would just book a flight back to Belgium and go straight to Adelaide and get on the plane and leave, and he would somehow be able to kind of wash his hands of the whole thing. But in fact, he left behind a trail of evidence that was a mile wide, which later came out in court. But that is in fact what he did. He drove her to Murray Bridge. He actually went into the motel reception area with her. She, of course, is looking terrible at this point. She's had a sleepless night. She's been sexually assaulted. She hasn't showered for a couple of days, and she's fearful and traumatised by her experience. And the woman at the motel immediately registered this. And Bristow tried to sort of make out that he was, I don't know, some friend of hers or some farmer who was just dropping her off, and tried to organise for her to book a ticket back to Belgium while she was at the motel. And then he basically skedaddled. This is where the impact of this on her became really evident, because you would think that at this point he's left, she's in this motel, she would just pick up the phone or say to the woman in the reception, "Can you please call the police?" But in fact, she goes to her room, she has a shower, she walks to McDonald's and gets herself some food, and she's walking back from McDonald's when an off-duty cop spots her and checks her appearance against the bulletin that's going around and realises that it's her, the missing girl from Belgium. And so he gets out of his car and approaches her, and she starts to, hurry away from him. And so it's clear that this story that Bristow had told her about the cops being corrupt and being in on this whole kidnapping scam was real to her, very, very real to her, and she was absolutely petrified of the police. And in fact, she really wouldn't let this guy approach her, even when he pulled out his badge. And she said to him, "How do I know, that's a genuine police ID?" Eventually, a female police officer was brought to talk to her, and she described Luciano as being just shaking with fear, even talking to the police. But they eventually convinced her that their intentions were good, and they showed her a photo of Bristow and she ID'd him. So that's when they definitively knew it was him.
Good evening. 9 News has filmed the moment police arrested a 52-year-old man who's accused of abducting a tourist at Murray Bridge. Police allege the man from Meningie raped the young woman while holding her hostage for more than 24 hours.
What I'd like to say is thank all the members of the public who provided the information, because some of the information was crucial. She is still with police, and she is well, unharmed, and obviously her family are very grateful for everything that's occurred and the fact that she is safe.
And when you say there was a mile of evidence, what sort of evidence had he left behind?
Well, when the police got his computer from home, they discovered that he had been, for 2 months, trawling through Gumtree, spinning all sorts of lies to various different backpackers, trying to lure them to his farm. And he'd had conversations with a number of young women in that time where he'd spun all the same lies about being from this company, and that they ran this chain of farms and that they preferred female workers. And he was even asking them, how old they were, did they have a boyfriend with them. very leading questions, which in fact made many of them suspicious. And in fact, it had taken him more than 2 months to actually get his first victim because of his suspicious sort of behaviour online. On top of that, he had purchased online a replica pistol and a set of novelty handcuffs.
So when you say a replica pistol, not a real one?
No.
Right.
Essentially a kind of a toy, but a realistic-looking toy. And the day before he picked Lucy Arnault up in Murray Bridge, he had gone to the hardware store in Meningie and bought a whole lot of cable ties. And so all of the things that she described to the police, the pistol that was jabbed into her back and the cable ties that were used to tie her up, he didn't actually use the handcuffs, were found on the farm. The pistol was found discarded in a paddock. The cable ties were there, and he had thrown her phone into the bottom of a water tank. And the phone was discovered some weeks later when his own son was repairing the tank and drained it and found her phone at the bottom of the water tank. And, of course, the police had Lucy Arnault's direct testimony of who he was and how the circumstances of how she ended up there. And she had injuries consistent with being tied up and consistent with being sexually assaulted. And so there was a massive evidence implicating him, plus which he had completely lied to his family about his whereabouts over that 48-hour period. So he told them he'd gone to Murray Bridge for a job interview, which was a lie. He didn't tell anyone in the family that he had willing worker, backpacker down in the shed. He didn't even concoct a story about why she might be there. He just, of course, hid that from his son and his wife. And when the police arrested him the next day, he had shaved all his hair off and his beard off to alter his appearance, and had thrown a whole lot of objects over the sofa and tried to hide the existence of the sofa in the pig shed. So there was a massive incriminating evidence and direct testimony from her that pinned the crime on him. And to my mind, it was just inexplicable that he chose to plead not guilty and try to throw this line out in court that she was this sort of fantasist who didn't like farm work and found it too grinding, and had concocted this whole story in order to cover the fact that she didn't have the oomph to be a farm worker.
Even though none of his family knew there was a woman just like metres away in a pig shed.
Well, when it got to... So he was arrested immediately, of course, and it got to court, and over the course of the investigation, the police found all this evidence that I've just mentioned. Then he agrees to testify in the trial, and I didn't observe him giving evidence in court, but the transcript he argued with the prosecutor. He seemed to think that he could sort of argue his way out of this case, and so his whole demeanour in the court was quite sort of strange and just completely out of touch with the reality of the situation he was in, because there was just such an overwhelming amount of evidence, and his story was so implausible. And his own family had agreed to give evidence against him because once his son found the phone in the water tank and learned that his father had lied to him about a number of things, clearly was so disgusted that he agreed to testify as a prosecution witness against his own father. His wife was going to be called, but in the end wasn't, for reasons that I don't think I'm allowed to talk about because they were sort of subject of a suppression order. But certainly there's no doubt that his family knew that he'd lied to them about it and that his son, felt he was guilty. And so the son's testimony was pretty damning, I think.
So they have all of that evidence in court. What is the conviction? What do they decide to do with Bristow?
Well, he's charged with rape and kidnapping, and he's put on trial in the District Court in South Australia. Because he's pleaded not guilty, Lucy Arnault is forced to testify, and his lawyer, grills her and pursues this story that Bristow is telling, which is that she's a fantasist and, she just made all this stuff up. The trauma of everything she'd been through is then compounded by having to be presented in court as a liar who's invented this whole story. She gave testimony over a number of hours. She's a very quiet, sort of demure sort of person, and she had a sort of basic English, so her expressions of what had happened to her were quite kind of simple and straightforward. But her testimony is extremely convincing because it's so plainly expressed, and her story just so plainly coheres with all of the rest of the evidence in the case. Bristow then spends hours and hours in the dock arguing with the prosecutor and engaging in these rambling monologues about his prowess as a welder and various other aspects of farming, and just seems completely lacking in any self-awareness, seemingly unaware of the fact that by pleading not guilty, by subjecting Luciano to this ordeal, he runs the risk of having a much heavier sentence than he would normally, because his sexual assaults were, to use the legal jargon, at the lower end of the scale, and he didn't use extreme violence, for instance. And so I think there was a possibility that he might not have got that heavier sentence, but because he did this, chose to plead not guilty, he ended up getting a heavier sentence than, he got 18 years.
Wow.
9 News can reveal for the first time the identity of the man accused of holding a backpacker hostage near Murray Bridge and repeatedly raping her. Jean Bristow today pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of rape and 1 count of detaining the woman against her will.
What was her victim impact statement when she sort of delivered that to the court? What was the contents of it?
It was very simple, simply expressed. She came to court, but she didn't actually deliver the statement herself, and she got the prosecutor to read it. But there were a number of things in it that she said. She said she felt foolish for the situation that she'd put herself in, her naivety at putting herself in this situation. And she described the terror that she'd felt when she was being held in this shed by this guy, that she would never see her parents again. I think there was a very real fear for her that the only option for him would be to kill her once he'd done whatever he wanted to do with her. And in fact, it's difficult to understand what Bristow's exit plan for this crime was. And that was one thing that really struck me about it, is he just didn't seem to have thought through anything of what he was doing. And so was he planning to just, drive her back to Murray Bridge or drive her to Adelaide and put her on a plane back to Belgium? I mean, he had apparently no history of violent crime. He didn't have a mental illness. It's not like he had bipolar disorder and so was in the throes of a mania attack when he did this. And so you wonder really what was he planning to do, and I'm sure that question must have been haunting her the entire time she was in that pig shed. How is this going to end?
And what would have happened if she hadn't have disrupted that plan by having, access to the internet? Yeah.
And so she spoke about the impact of that on her and how it had really profoundly affected her now, because she had been this adventurous person who travelled, and it had taken her nearly a year to be able to sort of just drive on her own in her hometown. She did not feel safe walking around the streets on her own at all. And that it had this profound impact on her, which, she had been taking sleeping pills to sleep. She had been undergoing counselling fairly constantly to get over it. There was one thing she said at the end where she said, sometimes I think it's a curse to be born a woman. I think we're not safe at all. And this was kind of an expression of how profoundly shaken she had been by this whole experience. So the prosecutor read this out in court while she sat behind him, and she was flanked by a couple of support people. That court hearing actually only took perhaps about 15 minutes. She walked in, she sat down in the front bench of the courtroom. The prosecutor got up and read her statement, and then the hearing ended and she left. And it was then a couple of months later that the sentence was actually brought down by the judge, in fact, quite recently, and Bristow was sentenced to 18 years in prison with a minimum of 12 and a half.
Was that sentence a surprise? Or do you think that because he didn't plead guilty, that was sort of expected?
I thought that he might get something like that. I never know how people react to sentences. I think 18 years is a pretty long stretch for a guy who's, 54, 55. In many ways, it's a really shocking crime. To kidnap an innocent young woman, tie her up in a filthy shed, take off her clothes, sexually assault her, with no plan apparently of how you're going to kind of extricate yourself from this, at the same time threatening her with all sorts of violence. But there was one thing about the case that I didn't really put this in the story because I didn't want it to be misinterpreted, but when police searched Bristow's computer, they found that one of his Google searches was fed up with life. And, he was sexually impotent, and I got the sense of him as rather a pathetic kind of individual, even though what he did was so malevolent. There was an aspect of the crime that was, and of him that I thought was sort of pathetic, and he seemingly had no history of this, unlike a lot of the other men who've been convicted recently of crimes against backpackers, who do have a history of sexually offending and do seem to have misogynistic impulses. Bristow didn't seem to be like that, and I found that a curious part of the story. And when I went to Meningie and interviewed people who knew him, they all sort of told the same story, which was that he was this sort of slightly hapless character who worked as a labourer. He bounced from job to job, was sort of argumentative but sort of a bit hapless, and they were just stunned that he would attempt to carry off such a ghastly crime.
Because this wasn't an isolated incident in that it had happened before, the Gumtree ad and having someone come to your property for farm work. Had that inspired what he had done?
I think there's evidence of that. So a year before he committed this crime, a man called Roman Hines, who was also based in Adelaide and was in fact a very predatory, misogynistic man, he had been involved in a series of sexual assaults of backpackers who he met up with through Gumtree ads. In fact, over the period of, I think it was 2014 to 2016, Hines had arranged to meet a number of backpackers, two of them in Adelaide he'd sexually assaulted, and he'd attacked his own partner. And he'd in fact taken a Japanese backpacker to Salt Creek, which is a fishing beach about 2 hours outside of Adelaide, and it's not far from Meningie. And the only reason that she didn't get attacked by him apparently is that she had posted a photo up on Facebook saying where she was. But shortly after that, some months after that incident, he picked up these two young backpackers, a Brazilian woman and a German woman, on a pretext of taking them to Victoria. And he took them to Salt Creek, the beach where he'd previously visited, and he perpetrated an absolutely atrocious attack in which he tied up the Brazilian woman and sexually assaulted her. And then when the German woman tried to intervene, he attacked her with a hammer and beat her with a hammer and then chased her around the beach in his four-wheel drive. Just this nightmarish scenario of her trying to evade this guy while the Brazilian girl was running in the opposite direction to escape him. And those two girls miraculously managed to survive that attack. And so Hines had been arrested a year before the Bristow incident happened, And the modus operandi of Hines had been revealed in the Adelaide Advertiser, that he'd placed these Gumtree ads. And when police went to Bristow's computer, they found that he had done searches and looked up information about the Salt Creek incident. He followed the modus operandi. He'd sort of researched the crime on the internet, and he lived in Meningie, which was, I think, half an hour up the coast from Salt Creek. So that crime was in fact investigated by the Meningie police, and it would have been the talk of the town at the time. I don't think there's any doubt that Bristow got some ideas.
Yeah, I thought he would kill me and I would die there. You feel kind of a bit ashamed in the beginning because you let someone trick you, you let someone fool you.
Do you think that this has changed Australia's reputation? Have these stories been reported internationally?
My sense of it is not. And I contacted a number of travel companies who do backpacker packages, and they all expressed quite a dismissive attitude about this. Hines and Bristow are just two of a whole range of incidents. I mean, you mentioned, of course, Ivan Milat is the kind of legendary. I mean, he killed 5 foreign backpackers and 2 Australian travellers over a 3-year period. There was a more recent case. In fact, it was happening around the same time as Bristow was kidnapping Lucy Arnault. This ice-addicted young guy in Queensland befriended a backpacker from Liverpool and ended up kidnapping her and terrorising her so much that she ended up on this wild sort of car journey with him through northern Queensland, in which he was beating her and sexually assaulting her in a sort of meth frenzy. And he was eventually caught. Now, he was recently jailed for 10 years. He pleaded guilty to those crimes. There's been a whole series of them, and the Salt Creek crimes were on 60 Minutes. The one I just mentioned was aired on Sunday night. I wrote my feature about the Bristow case. And so these things have had a lot of attention here. But when I spoke to backpacker companies, they expressed sort of puzzlement that anyone would talk about safety issues.
Or be afraid of that.
Or be conscious of that. And as I say, one of the main backpacker companies, the head of that company, joked that, people were more afraid of our wild animals than the possibility of being attacked or molested by someone. And look, hundreds of thousands of people come to Australia every year, and so it's true that these cases are anomalous in some way. But when we published our story, we got a number of letters from people who described, if not similar, but certainly threatening situations that they'd been in. One person had been forced to milk cows dressed in a bikini, because of this perverse sort of attraction that the farmer had for her. And there have been a number of cases of farmers being convicted for more minor kind of sexual assaults, if you want to put it that way. But it does seem like you're in a vulnerable situation. If you're a traveller, you don't know the country, you're in an isolated rural area, you are in quite a kind of vulnerable situation. You're far from home, and it does seem that there are people out there who are certainly prepared to take advantage of that.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I really appreciate it, and I think your story is really important for sort of shedding a light on that, and potentially, it might need regulation. If this is a requirement that they have to go and do 88 days, then there's got to be some sort of regulating that you don't just go and find someone on Gumtree. That can't be safe.
Well, one would think that there must be some way of at least compiling some information about which farms have been the subject of complaints or some sort of central body that would take complaints, because I think one of the things with backpackers is they perhaps don't know how to lodge complaints or what to do, and maybe they've suffered some sort of harassment or molestation which they're just they just think, well, I'll just get away from it and carry on with my holiday. And, when you're on holiday, do you want to spend a whole lot of time, talking to the police, getting the police to take a statement and going through that whole process? If you feel like you haven't suffered a major trauma, well, perhaps not. But I think it probably would be good if there was some sort of central place that you could at least report incidents to, because it seems that there are quite a number of people who are taking advantage of these young people.
That's so true. So true. Thank you again for making time for us today.
Thanks very much.
You can read Richard Guilliatt's feature about the story of Lucy Arnaud, or Davine Arckens, online at the Australian website via the link in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast, hosted by me, Jessie Stephens. Our senior producer and editor is Elise Cooper. If you liked this episode, you can join the True Crime Conversations Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations or click the link in the notes of this episode. True Crime Conversations will be back next week, looking at crimes through the eyes of those that know the most about them.